Are Nintendo Switch 2 games selling poorly? Let's jump into the numbers and make some predictions ahead of Nintendo's quarterly financials out this Friday, May 8th. So, on May 8th, Nintendo is going to release their quarterly financials to their investors, but that data is publicly available. So we have the most recent quarter, which is the quarter finishing December 31st, here on screen for you now. And it shows that the Nintendo Switch 2 had sold 17.37 million units and just under 38 million units of software. You can also see that the Nintendo Switch has sold just over 155 million units and 1.5 billion units of software. Huge amount. And the big question for Nintendo this quarter is their forecast for their full financial year. The financial year in Japan finishes at the end of March, and they have forecasted 19 million units of Switch 2 hardware sold, which is the amount we're less concerned about. I more want to focus today about the software because they are predicting 48 million units of software sold, which means they have to come up with 10 million units of software in the March quarter to get to those figures. They need to also sell 1.63 million units of hardware, the Switch 2 console, to get to those forecasted figures, which we'll jump into shortly, and I'll show you. I believe that they've got those figures pretty quickly, but you will see that this website is always available on Nintendo's website. Just search JP Nintendo sales data. It also shows the top 10 sold in terms of their software, and you'll see that Mario Kart World has sold 14 million units, 4 million for DK Bonanza, just under 4 million for Legend ZA. That doesn't include the Switch 1 version, which has sold more units than that. And Kirby Air Riders has sold 1.76. The big story last quarter was that Metroid Prime 4 and Hyrule Warriors weren't on this list because as of the 31st of December, they hadn't sold 1 million units, nor had any of the Switch 2 editions, such as Kirby and the Forgotten Land or Super Mario Party Jamboree. Drag X Drive didn't sell that as well, but I don't think anyone was really expecting that. So jumping into this quarter, one of the things that is really easy to be able to check out is Japan's physical sales actually get released weekly by Famitsu, which is a big gaming magazine over in Japan. And as of the 31st of December, just going to that sort of week, you can see the Switch 2 has sold just under 4.1 million units at the end of 2025. It could also carry over to the first week of January. That's roughly when this week happened, of this data. And you can see as of the end of March, it has now jumped up to 5 million units sold, which is roughly 1 million units of the Switch 2 has sold in the last quarter. And that is what makes me believe more than 1.63 million units will be sold. Even though the Switch 2 is selling very strongly in Japan compared to the rest of the world, I do believe that the rest of the world will be able to come up with at least 600,000 units to sell, even though it has been reported that 30% of the production rate of the Switch 2 has been decreased. And with big games like Pocopia, Resident Evil, and Final Fantasy VII Remake was a big seller as well. I would like to also jump into the individual games that have been sold. So just jumping back to this now. As an example, Mario Kart World had sold 2.7 million units in Japan, and by the time the quarter had finished, it was just under 2.9. Now, I've scrolled through all of this data. There's about 15 or 16 games on this list, and it's about 1.6 million units have sold on the Switch 2 just physically in Japan. This doesn't include Dragon Quest VII Reimagined, which we know has sold very similarly to the amount on the Nintendo Switch. So let's just say 200,000 units. So it would be safe to say, if you include Final Fantasy VII, which I haven't got the numbers for, roughly 2 million units of software physically have sold in Japan last quarter. Now, that would make you initially think that there is a very big likelihood of the rest of the world being able to come up with 8 million units to get to that magic 48 million unit figure. However, when I was checking this out, I did notice, and I will have to scroll down here because the game's not selling very well, and so much so that I can't even see it. Here it is. Mario Tennis Fever has sold 99,000 units in Japan. Now, that is just physical units, but it does paint a very worrying picture in terms of how Nintendo Switch software is being sold. And the reason I want to go back to this is 17 million units had sold at the end of December and 38 million units of software. The Mario Kart World that is bundled in with the system is included in that 38 million. That's why 14 million units of Mario Kart World have sold. How many of those do you think were bundled in with the system? Conservatively, let's say 10 million units. That's kind of lets us know that, roughly speaking, if you take 10 million off that 38 million figure and say 28 million game sales have actually happened that aren't bundled with the console, it tells you that, roughly speaking, every person that has bought a Switch 2 has purchased roughly 1.5 games if you exclude the bundled in Mario Kart World. And now that's what starts to paint the worrying picture for me, because you look at these sales data and you see that Mario Tennis Fever, hasn't sold very well at all. And at the same time, games like Metroid Prime 4 have likely barely gotten past 1 million units sold for a game that is rumored to have cost north of $100 million US. That is a bit of an issue. They weren't necessarily expecting it to sell 5 million units straight off the bat, but they were expecting more than what has been sold. Same with Hyrule Warriors. The initial game on Switch 1, the Age of Calamity, sold roughly 5 million units. Now, to be fair, a hell of a lot more Switches were in the wild when that game went out. So, of course, you've got to put a big asterisk on that. But it is something to put out there. The big question for me is what is going on with third parties at the moment? Because there has been the big story that Borderlands 4, which was initially meant to come out first week of October on Switch 2, roughly 3 weeks after other platforms, it was delayed so the development team could focus on all the bugs that were in those other versions. And then in basically about a month ago, it was announced that, yeah, we're sort of not going to be working on this version anymore. There was unbelievably a physical version found in the wild, I believe out in Brazil. And so that is something to be aware of. And then also about a month ago, 007 First Light was announced that the Switch 2 version was getting delayed. And the reason I'm curious about this is it possible that Switch 2 games aren't selling as well as people were expecting? You're always going to see people point to something like Pokemon Pocopia, which sold 2.2 million units in its first 4 days, was very hard to find. But my belief that the reason that it was very hard to find is Nintendo really didn't either have the faith in the game and its ability to sell, or the fact that they were seeing other games being released and them not selling very well, that they didn't put enough stock on the shelves in anticipation of this game's release. So I want to look at a big third-party title that came across, which was Resident Evil Requiem. There have been rumors that the sales have gone anywhere from 5 to 20% of the overall sales. And right now, when you consider that there are 7 million total units, I believe, of Resident Evil Requiem that have sold, 20% would be a nice handy figure, roughly 1.4 million units. Europe found in the initial sales that roughly 5% were selling on Switch 2, which would be very, very low. And for the week that it came out in Japan, we've got the actual figures that were sold physically, and you can see that roughly 40,000 were sold on Switch 2, which was roughly 20% of what was sold on PlayStation 5 solely in Japan. But I do think the figure is probably more than 5%, but significantly lower than 20% as to what was sold for this system. And considering the Resident Evil Requiem is the biggest selling game so far this year and probably the biggest profile release, it is worrying in some respects that maybe, let's say, 10% of the overall sales have come from that game on Switch 2. I think Nintendo and Capcom, who developed the game, would have hoped that the game would have sold stronger. So that brings us to the big point that has come up within the last 6 weeks, which is Nintendo has announced that the pricing for digital games will now be cheaper than those on store shelves. So if you're in the States, Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, which comes out in a couple of weeks, will now be $60 digitally and $70 physically. My guess is that they're not doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. It is that games aren't selling to Nintendo's expectations going in to the Switch 2 generation, and they've had to pivot, and they're doing so by dropping prices on the digital store. Over 70 games that Nintendo developed or published sold over 1 million copies on the Nintendo Switch, which is unbelievable when you think about it. And I think they were expecting a very similar thing to happen. And now we're seeing that that might not be the case going into this generation. And it might not 100% be Nintendo's fault here. The big thing that no company can ignore is that we are kind of in an unofficial recession at the moment. And people are doing it tough, and buying games is very much a luxury. And so people are really picking and choosing the games that they want to pick up. And as a result, Nintendo releasing a game at the moment roughly every 6 weeks or more frequently, quite frankly. Really only the absolute diehards like myself are going to be picking up multiple games throughout the year in a way that other people aren't. More people have asked me about Pocopia than any other game that's come out this year on the Switch 2. And that game is going to sell absolute gangbusters and potentially mask the bigger issue that's going on here. But when we take that step back and go, will Nintendo come up with the magical 10 million sold to get to that 48 million forecast software sales? I think they will fall over the line. But I do believe the sales for Pokemon Pocopia, which is going to be a lot more than that 2.2 million figure. I would not be surprised if by the end of the month, the game released on March 5th, the 2.2 million figure is at the end of March 8th. So it does have 3 more weeks on the market. and the game was still going quite viral throughout March. So I would not be surprised if figures were towards double that. I'd be surprised if it got to literally double that, but I think Pocopia is going to be potentially masking a lot of issues that potentially could pop up if the overall figure popped in at about 45 million instead of that 48 million figure that Nintendo probably were conservatively posting in hopes that they'd blast through sort of 50 million and go, look at us, everything's going very well. So that is my overall thoughts right now. I just thought I'd put that out there ahead of Friday's financials so you can have a look at it as well and see if figures are as rosy as Nintendo hopes they are. But I think if the price is being dropped on their games digitally, they're really just trying to start moving some units because they're not expecting that they're going to sell at $70 that they really thought they would be able to. So let me know what you think. This is a bit of maybe a controversial viewpoint in the hardcore Nintendo space, but yeah, let me know what you think. Do you think Nintendo will make me look like a fool in about 4 days from now, or am I onto something here? Be sure to like and subscribe. We've got a lot more videos coming. My big video that I'm working on for next month is my best games on Switch 2. I'm playing games like crazy. I'm slowly working on a Pragmata review as well. Be sure to like and subscribe. I'll see you another time.